Now we are learning more about why the Rolling Stones canceled their tour, which includes a stop right here in New Orleans at Jazz Fest.
Yeah, Mick Jagger will undergo surgery to replace a valve in his heart. That's according to rollingstones.com.
For 60 years, Mick Jagger has been one of the most recognizable human beings on the planet. He has sold hundreds of millions of records, filled stadiums on every continent, and maintained a level of fame that most entertainers never approach even briefly. And yet, despite all of that exposure, despite the thousands of interviews and the decades of public scrutiny, the people who have studied him most closely have always had the same feeling, that the man standing in front of the cameras was not entirely the man who existed behind them. Recently, in conversations and reflections spread across the last several years, Jagger has begun pulling back certain curtains he kept closed for most of his career. What has emerged is a portrait that is significantly more layered, more honest, and in some ways more surprising than the legend that preceded it. The starting point has to be something that shaped everything else in his professional life, something he spent decades discussing only in carefully managed terms. His creative partnership with Keith Richards is the foundation of the Rolling Stones, the source of their most enduring music, and also, as Jagger has increasingly been willing to acknowledge, one of the most genuinely complicated relationships of his life. They first encountered each other as young boys in Dartford before losing touch and crossing paths again as teenagers at a railway station in 1961. Richards noticed that Jagger was carrying American rhythm and blues records that were extraordinarily difficult to find in England at that time. That shared hunger for music nobody else around them seemed to have become the seed of everything that followed. What grew from that seed was not only a musical partnership but an intertwined life. They lived together in a chaotic flat in Chelsea in the early days, wrote songs together in borrowed time between gigs, and built something that neither of them could have built alone. The Jagger-Richards songwriting credit became one of the most recognizable in popular music, representing a catalogue of songs that defined an era and continued to resonate long after that era ended. But the nature of how two people produce that kind of work together over that length of time is never simple, and Jagger has in recent years been more willing than before to speak honestly about what the reality of that partnership has actually looked like from the inside. He has acknowledged that the years during which Richards was struggling most severely with substance addiction placed enormous strain on the band and on everyone working around Richards at the time. Jagger has described those periods not with the kind of romantic mythology that sometimes gets attached to rock excess, but with a plainness that communicates something closer to exhaustion. He has spoken about the way addiction changes the pace of everything, the way it introduces an unpredictability that affects every person in proximity to it, and the way that working within those conditions required a particular kind of patience that was not always easy to maintain. He has been honest that he did not always handle it well, and honest that there were moments when the band's survival felt genuinely uncertain. What he has also confirmed, perhaps more significantly, is that there is a deeper and more permanent tension in his relationship with Richards that has nothing to do with those specific years and everything to do with a fundamental difference in how the two men understand what the Rolling Stones is and what it is supposed to be. Richards has consistently held a certain position, that the band represents something pure, something rooted in the blues tradition that created it, and that his role is to protect that essence against the forces of commercialization and compromise. Jagger has increasingly occupied a different position. As the person who manages the actual business of keeping an organization of that complexity functioning, who makes the commercial decisions and oversees the operational reality of what the Rolling Stones requires to continue existing at the level it occupies. Richards has at various points over the years criticized Jagger publicly for this orientation, and some of those criticisms have been pointed enough that they raised genuine questions about the future of the band. Jagger's response has generally been measured, but what he has confirmed in recent conversations is something more honest than a measured response usually reveals. He has said, in effect, that he and Richards are never going to see this the same way, and that he has stopped expecting them to. That is a significant admission from someone who has spent 6 decades in creative partnership with another person. It is the kind of peace that only comes after you have accepted that certain disagreements are not going to be resolved, and that you can either let that fact destabilize everything or find a way to work alongside it. Jagger has chosen to work alongside it. Whether that has always been easy is a different question, and the answer is almost certainly no. There is something in Jagger's way of describing all of this that reveals something important about who he is as a person. He has spent his entire adult life bound in close quarters with people whose inner experiences he acknowledges he does not fully know. He has said, when asked what Richards was going through during the hardest years, that he genuinely does not know, because they did not have those conversations. That is a striking thing to admit about someone you have spent 60 years alongside. But it is not a failure of closeness. It is an honest description of a particular kind of person, someone who is intensely present, who observes everything, who is deeply committed to the work, and who simultaneously maintains a certain internal distance from emotional directness that has been consistent throughout his life. Jagger is not someone who processes things through open vulnerability. He processes them through endurance, through work, and through the long passage of time. The other relationship that shaped him most profoundly, and about which he has spoken with increasing candor, is his relationship with Brian Jones, the founding member of the Rolling Stones who assembled the original group and named the band before his role became increasingly untenable and his place in the lineup ultimately unsustainable. Jones's story is one of genuine tragedy. He was extraordinarily talented, musically adventurous in ways that influenced the band's early sound significantly, and also someone whose personal difficulties grew more severe as the pressure of fame intensified. By 1969, the band had made the decision to remove him from the group he had founded, and weeks later, Jones was found dead at his home in East Sussex at 27 years old. Jagger has spoken about this period in terms that are notably free of the self-protective vagueness that sometimes characterizes how public figures discuss painful chapters. He has acknowledged that the band's treatment of Jones during his decline was not always compassionate, that young men in close proximity to someone struggling can sometimes respond with cruelty rather than care, and that he personally behaved in ways he later recognized as reflecting immaturity rather than genuine malice. He has said that their unkindness toward Jones was in part a reaction to his vulnerability, a dynamic that he clearly finds uncomfortable to examine but has not avoided examining. The honesty in those reflections is not the honesty of someone seeking absolution. It is the honesty of someone who has sat with something for a long time and arrived at a clear-eyed account that does not flatter himself. What Jagger has described about the recording sessions for the album Beggar's Banquet in 1968 is particularly illuminating in this context. He has said that those sessions contained what he felt was the last moment of Jones being genuinely and fully present in the band's music, specifically during the recording of the song No Expectations. After that, what Jagger describes is a slow and painful absence, Jones still physically present but creatively disconnected, no longer capable of being the person the band had originally formed around. The loss, Jagger has suggested, was not sudden. It unfolded gradually over years, in front of everyone who was close to it, and the gradual nature of it in some ways made it harder rather than easier to process. Looking at both of these relationships together, the one with Jones and the one with Richards, a pattern emerges that Jagger himself has begun to articulate in recent years. He has spent much of his career in close proximity to people of extraordinary talent whose capacity for self-destruction was equally extraordinary. He has had to find ways to remain tethered to those relationships, to continue producing work within them and through them, while absorbing the costs that came with the territory. He was not able to save Jones. He was not able to change the trajectory of Richards's most difficult years. What he was able to do was remain present, keep working, and eventually find a kind of understanding about what those experiences meant that he was not able to reach while they were happening. The episode at Altamont Speedway in December of 1969 is the moment in the Stones' history that has received the most sustained cultural analysis, and also the one about which Jagger's personal account diverges most significantly from the way the event has been publicly processed. The concert, organized with inadequate preparation and secured through an arrangement with the Hells Angels motorcycle club that quickly deteriorated into violence, resulted in 4 deaths, including that of a young man whose killing was captured on film. The event became a cultural marker, shorthand for the collapse of 1960s idealism, the moment when a particular kind of optimism encountered its own limits. Jagger has consistently pushed back against the symbolic weight that has been placed on Altamont, not because he wants to minimize what happened but because he finds the process of converting a specific tragedy into a cultural symbol to be a way of abstracting away from the actual human reality of what occurred. His response to Altamont, as he has described it, was immediate and personal. A young man died at an event he had organized. People were hurt. The shock and grief of that were not things that translated into larger conclusions about the decade or about idealism or about the counterculture. They were simply the specific and terrible facts of what had happened. There is an element of the Altamont aftermath that received far less attention than the event itself, and which Jagger has addressed in a way that adds considerably to the picture. Following the concert and Jagger's public criticism of what had occurred, there were reportedly those who harbored serious anger toward him as a result. Accounts emerged later, including from documentary sources and former law enforcement figures, suggesting that a plan had been discussed to target Jagger at his property, an approach reportedly abandoned when circumstances prevented it from proceeding. Jagger has confirmed that he was not informed of this at the time, and that he learned about it later from reporting rather than from anyone who had a direct responsibility to tell him. What that detail adds to his account is significant. He spoke publicly about what he had witnessed and what he believed about the responsibility for the violence at Altamont without knowing that the act of speaking had generated a serious threat against him that had been kept from his knowledge. Whatever decisions were made by people around him about what he needed to know were made without his input, and he found out the truth on a much longer timeline than the people involved. Jagger has not dramatized this in his public discussions of it, but the reflection he has offered suggests that it produced in him a particular understanding. That visibility and the willingness to speak plainly about what you see can produce consequences that operate entirely beyond your awareness, and that this is a reality you eventually have to make sense of. When Jagger discusses his early life in Dartford and the specific quality of the household he grew up in, what comes through is the portrait of an environment that gave him something essential. His family was not wealthy, was not particularly connected to artistic or bohemian culture, and was navigating a period of significant national difficulty. What the household had was a kind of internal self-sufficiency, a culture of people entertaining each other, performing for each other, generating the energy of a room from within rather than seeking it from outside. Jagger has described this as the first place he encountered something he later recognized as fundamental to who he is, the ability and the instinct to hold a room, to generate a reaction, to be the thing that changes the atmosphere around it. His early encounters with American rhythm and blues music opened something up in him that the England of his youth did not easily accommodate. The physical freedom of that music, the emotional directness of it, the way it communicated things that English culture of that era kept carefully managed and controlled, represented a possibility that felt genuinely elsewhere. When the Rolling Stones eventually traveled to America in 1964 and encountered the country that had produced that music, Jagger's reaction was one of genuine complexity. He found New York electric and immediately understandable. He found other parts of America considerably more difficult to process. What he encountered was a society that was still operating, in significant portions, under formal racial segregation, where the musicians who had created the music he had built his entire sense of possibility around were navigating conditions of restriction and brutality that bore no relationship to the idea of freedom those records had seemed to represent from England. Jagger has confirmed that this experience changed something in how he understood the relationship between art and the conditions under which it is created. The music he loved had not come from freedom. It had come from people who were navigating the absence of freedom, and who had produced something extraordinary precisely within those constraints. He has carried that understanding with him, and it is part of what produces the quality in his thinking that people who know him well consistently describe: the ability to hold contradictions simultaneously without feeling the need to resolve them artificially, to succeed commercially within a system while maintaining a clear view of what that system costs and what it obscures.